In this video, we're going to be discussing the patterns of evolution, basically how species change from one species to another or one species to many different species, and how fast that actually occurs. So, what actually is evolution? Who is Darwin? Evolution started long before Darwin. Looking into evolution, how it happened, and all of that started a long, long time ago, but Darwin's book was the actual first piece of the puzzle. He actually had data to support his thoughts, and he actually wrote it all down and put everything together. So it started this whole shift towards looking at our environment and looking at individual species to figure out how evolution and where we all came from, because everyone wants to know where you actually came from. And since Darwin, we have expanded and retested and actually refined and slightly changed the original theory that Darwin had. So it's kind of ironic that his theory of natural selection has evolved ever since he started it. So what we are actually going to discuss more specifically is the ideas on his general theory of natural selection. So the theory of natural selection is also known as the survival of the fittest. So basically, the organisms best suited for their environment will survive to produce more offspring. So the idea that what actually makes something best suited kind of depends on the environment. So it's not just, the strongest will survive, but if the strongest person is best suited for that environment, if that's what's needed for that environment, then they will survive. Another major aspect of this whole idea is the fact that they have to be able to reproduce and pass that genetic information on to their offspring in order for that species to survive. So he, as in Darwin, came up with the theory of natural selection, survival of the fittest, saying, best suited will survive, but then we have refined over the year as to what is best suited, and that it completely and totally depends on the actual environment that the species is living in. So all of this boils down to actually creating a new species, which is the ultimate result of evolution. And speciation is the creation of a species, and it occurs in sexually reproducing organisms when two populations become so different that they can no longer interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If you remember the vocabulary from before, is that species is a group of organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. So if two organisms cannot interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then they are a different species. And this is caused by various reasons. There could be geographic isolation. Basically, the two organisms never meet up because they live in different places. Ecological isolation, the fact that they live in different types of ecosystems and therefore also never meet up. Behavioral isolation, this could be different mating calls, different mating times or seasons, the nocturnal versus diurnal, so they never actually also meet up. And the seasonal isolation is a form of behavioral where they will migrate in different seasons, so they won't be around during their mating season, or they mate in different seasons as well. Most of these, because the major aspect of two different species is reproduction, are some form of reproductive isolation. And there are actually two types of reproductive isolation. The two types of reproductive isolation are prezygotic and postzygotic. The prezygotic mechanism is the fact that the gametes never meet, so there's no mating that actually occurs due to geographic isolation, so therefore never actually going to meet. Mismatched mating behavior, so different mating calls or mating seasons, and the seasonal isolation, like the different mating seasons. The postzygotic mechanism is when mating and fertilization occur, but the zygote doesn't develop normally. So either the zygote is never born, dies at an early age, or is infertile. So the zygote never can reproduce. So this would be, an example would be the mule. The mule is an infertile organism made by a horse and a donkey. So horses and donkeys are two different species because even though they can reproduce, they produce an infertile offspring. The whole liger, the tiger and lion idea, is also they are still different species even though they produce a liger, because they would never in the wild actually reproduce because of geographic isolation. So even though they can produce that liger, it has been forced by humans. So that is still two different species. So those are the causes of speciation, but what actually happens and what are the common patterns of speciation? So what actually does occur and what makes the new species? Is it environmentally or just the species evolving and getting better itself? So there are a few different common patterns, and coevolution is one of them. This is when two or more species change in association with each other. So this goes back to the predator and prey relationships. So the predator gets faster to catch the prey, and the prey then has to get faster to get away from the predator. So each one of them evolve on their own, but in relationship to the other one. There's also the plants become lighter and more colorful to be visual by birds and bats and insects, and then insects often become the color of the flowers so that they can blend in and camouflage. So they change their color patterns due to the relationship of pollination. The next type is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is when the environment chooses similar traits. So if you look at any fish in the water, they look very similar. And they have very similar outward appearance because that is the best suited for their environment. And this results in organisms that are not related to actually look similar. So the dolphins that are actually mammals look like fish because they live in the same environment. So this could be an example of where you think two things have actually come from a common ancestor and haven't. And it's due to convergent evolution. But in this way, you can also see what the environment chooses. So what was best suited to live in the ocean, because all the fish and dolphins have the dorsal tail. So that was best suited, and therefore you can look back in the fish ancestry and see how they've evolved to have that and become best suited for their environment. The next type is divergent evolution. Divergent evolution is when a population diverges from each other and becomes two related populations and eventually species. And this is usually due to different habitats. So this is the actual process of speciation. So you have one population and one species becoming two. And the two types are adaptive radiation, which is when you have one species creating a whole bunch, and it's generally due to different habitats to avoid competition. So the example of the Darwin finches, they have different sized beaks, so they didn't have to compete over the same food, so that they could each eat their own food and not have to compete. Artificial selection is what we have created so many dogs by. There's actually human choice, so it's choices by the breeders. So dogs are bred by humans, various cows and cattle have different types because they're the meat cow and then there's the milk cow. So we have, as humans, actually created two different species and a few different species of cows and dogs just for the purpose of we want them, so we choose it. So it has evolution occurring, but on the other hand, it's human run. So divergent evolution has the ability to create a whole bunch of different species all at once. If you have a population that goes to an island with a variety of habitats, that one population, that one species is going to evolve differently depending on where they end up living in the island. So now, how fast does that divergent evolution actually happen? It depends on the environment and it depends on the organism. So there's two ideas. There's gradualism, which is the slow change, and it's a slow accumulation of minor changes that you end up with two different species. Then there's punctuated equilibrium, where you have the short period of rapid change. So all of a sudden, a new population is a different color, and completely different color, not just, a slightly shade lighter. And that's called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium often creates a lot of new species all at once, whereas gradualism, it's a gradual change. It's a slow change throughout many years, and eventually they will realize that they're different species. So punctuated equilibrium is more immediate, new species, gradualism is not. So those are the two major rates. Obviously, there are also some that fall under different categories and kind of an in-between, but it has to do with the mutations and environment. If the environment rapidly changes, it's most likely going to be punctuated equilibrium. If there's a major mutation in a gene that changes the color, then that is punctuated equilibrium. But if the environment slowly gets warmer, then you slowly adjust to the warmth. So that would be the gradualism. You slowly adjust with the environment. Now, this brings up a point you have to also remember that all of these have to do with there has to be a mutation. So none of this can occur without DNA mutation and gene mutations that change the phenotype or genotype of that organism.